Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Senator John Kennedy of Massachusetts. To some, the Democratic Party represents a philosophy, a point of view, a way of life. Others think in terms of personalities, of the great Democratic leaders of past and present. To others, the party is an old friend of the family. To others, it is a crusading cause. To still others, a treasury of fundamental truths. But whatever the unique quality of the party may represent to each of you, I believe that you will find it in the course of this film, which singles out the principal events which have given our party special character and dignity, which make it today, as always, the nation's best and greatest hope. Whatever living thing endures long in this world must have solid substance and great inner strength. The Democratic Party, whose 32nd National Convention you comprise, is the oldest political party in the world today. In its entire history, it has been dedicated to one objective above all, an objective expressed by the magic phrase familiar to every person in America, the pursuit of happiness. For happiness means to a nation much the same things it means to us as individuals. It means peace. It means prosperity. It means responsibility. It means security. Democrats have pursued these meanings of happiness ever since the phrase was coined 180 years ago by the first leader of the Democratic Party. You have only to reach in your pocket for his likeness, Thomas Jefferson, whose memory lives among us in 1,000 ways, in the heritage of freedom which he, conspicuously among our founding fathers, left to us. Freedoms that in their time were as bold and unprecedented as the New Deal and the Fair Deal were in our time, but which today are taken for granted. The freedom to worship in our own way, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right peaceably to assemble, the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The Bill of Rights, sacred to every American because it protects every American, was in no small measure inspired by Thomas Jefferson. But that was only to be expected from the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence. This is the man, and what greater ancestor could a living political party ask for? He was not only the idealist who created the most poetic, exciting, and forceful statement of freedom in the history of the world, but he was also in many ways a practical man. Practical enough to double the size of the United States by a single master stroke, the Louisiana Purchase. For $50 million, Jefferson bought us a territory that began at the mouth of the Mississippi and stretched north to Canada and west to the ridge of the Rockies. It included the richest river valley in the entire world, the Mississippi, a great buy no matter how you look at it. One historian has called the Louisiana Purchase the best bargain in American diplomatic history. Historically, we've been called the party of strong presidents, and there's a good reason for it. Not long after Jefferson, another Democratic president was the first to formulate a permanent foreign policy for Americans. He was James Monroe, whose famous doctrine, bearing his name, has come down to this day as a vital force in keeping foreign powers from any aggressive designs on the entire Western Hemisphere. During Monroe's administration, 5 more states became part of the growing republic. But with the next Democratic president, more than states were added to the Union. Andrew Jackson, hero of the Battle of New Orleans, was elected 7th President of the United States. We treasure his accomplishments for the Western pioneers and for the working man in the cities. Under Jackson, we turned away from aristocracy and exclusion and towards a wider freedom, often noisy and turbulent, but always strong and progressive. Growth, of course, is often painful. After the era of Jackson came war with Mexico, the annexation of Texas and the growing dispute over slavery, with its attempts at compromise, the raids of John Brown, the little giant Stephen Douglas, and Abraham Lincoln, one of the immortals of our country and the world. But after Lincoln's assassination in office, control of the Republican Party immediately passed to smaller men, hotheads and fanatics, bound for vengeance against the South. And when the Democrat Andrew Johnson tried to carry out Lincoln's policies of humaneness and compassion, the Republican-controlled Congress impeached him and came within a single vote in the Senate of convicting and ousting him, without regard to the elementary requirements of evidence, justice, or the nation's welfare. From the time of the war between the states up to this very convention, Democratic presidents have carried on a tradition of strength, of concern for the common man, of zealousness for civil liberties. Grover Cleveland was elected twice, the second time after an unsatisfactory intervening Republican administration. One Democratic candidate of this period who did not win office towers head and shoulders over most of the Republicans who did. He was William Jennings Bryan, who 60 years ago told a Democratic convention in this same city, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." It took the biggest and most expensive campaign in American history to defeat Bryan, a campaign directed by the tycoon Mark Hanna, who pioneered in the theory that the Republican Party is the party of big business, and that it is, therefore, the business of big business to see that the Republicans get in. The country's mightiest corporations put up millions against Bryan, and they got their money's worth when the Republicans won. It was not the last time that entrenched wealth was to be arrayed against the Democratic Party. Even today, 2 generations later, the cartoonists are still observing it, the continuing endowment of the GOP and the uses to which it is put. Be that as it may, the Democratic Party in 1912 won the presidency for another one of the world's immortals, Woodrow Wilson. As governor of New Jersey, he whipped an entrenched political machine and cleaned out corruption. And as President of the United States, he set out to make the free enterprise system really free by broadening its benefits to include the many instead of the few. Before his first term was half over, he took the nation's credit system out of the hands of the trusts and placed it under government control through the Federal Reserve Act. It is working today. He set up the Federal Trade Commission to end unfair methods of competition. It is working today. He sponsored and signed the Clayton Antitrust Act to put a brake on interlocking directorates. It is working today. He led the way to a reduction of duties on almost 1,000 items. He helped farmers by matching dollar for dollar state funds for agricultural expansion. He gave organized labor the greatest gains it had yet made in American history, and took the first steps towards the abolition of child labor. When Woodrow Wilson took office, 2 million children under 16 years of age were employed in factories. Girls of 6 and 7 worked 13 hours a day in cotton mills. Wilson's Democratic Congress passed a law that dealt child labor a setback from which it never recovered, although the final death blow came under a later Democratic president. And let's not forget, all of us who take the 8-hour working day for granted, that it had to be won after long and bitter struggle. It was won by a Democratic administration, Wilson's. Republican leaders were, of course, opposed to the 8-hour day. Their presidential candidate of 1916 called it labor's gold brick. The Wilson era brought new freedom to children, to working men, and also, importantly, to women. It was no accident that women's right to vote was written into law under the wing of a Democratic administration. But there were battles to fight on more than home ground. For 3 years, Woodrow Wilson tried to keep America out of the war, in which the Central Powers had embroiled Europe. But the Kaiser's arrogance and aggression made it impossible for us to be neutral any longer. We have all seen enough movies based on that war to remember its terrible outlines. In the aftermath of that war came Woodrow Wilson's dream of banding nations together in an effort to end war for all time. Also in the aftermath of that war came the deliberate sabotage by a few Republican leaders of Wilson's great dream. Broken-hearted by the destruction of his peace plans, President Wilson made a solemn prophecy.
I can predict with absolute certainty that within another generation there will be another world war. The weapons used in this war were toys compared with what will be used in the next war.
Republican isolationism insisted that Wilson and the Democratic Party were wrong. History proved them right. After Wilson's clean, free administration came a quite different phenomenon in Washington, the Republican era of Warren G. Harding, which has been stigmatized as one of the most corrupt in history. President Harding died in office and was succeeded by Calvin Coolidge. Solidly back in control of the government were Republicans representing the same groups that had favored special interests down through American history. And a false prosperity spiraled upward in a dizzy boom, while Herbert Hoover succeeded Calvin Coolidge and inherited what the Republicans called normalcy and rugged individualism. But the honeymoon came to a sudden and sickening end after Mr. Hoover was in office only 8 months. In the space of a few fearsome days in the fall of 1929, $50 billion vanished from the stock market. It was a crash felt around the world, but mostly here at home. 15 million unemployed, the misery and agony of relief kitchens and apple vending, the idle factories, the foreclosed homes, the business failures, all these are too recent in the memories of most of us to be recalled without emotion. 5,000 banks closed. Private construction stopped. There was the shameful incident of the bonus army. Hungry veterans descended on Washington to petition for immediate relief. Tanks and tear gas were used against them. There were casualties. It was a low mark in the history of the relationship of any American government with the men who had gallantly fought its wars. Things were bad everywhere. The richest nation on earth became a huge camp of jobless, hungry people. The machines stopped. Factories shut down. The fires were banked. Darkness descended over the land. We were at the lowest ebb in our history. And then, out of the darkness, came a voice.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. Let us all here assembled constitute ourselves prophets of a new order of competence and of courage.
The place, Chicago, the Democratic National Convention of 1932. The speaker, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
This is more than a political campaign. It is a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
America wanted him and elected him. 42 out of 48 states swept him into office. The times needed greatness, and he had it. Like the strong Democratic presidents who preceded him, Franklin Roosevelt was a man of action. He combined Jefferson's philosophy with Jackson's courage and Wilson's ability to tap the moral reserves of the country. He led the way to a vast social reconstruction, which has changed for the better the lives of everybody watching this film. He closed the banks to stop the panic and reopened them after taking measures to ensure their safety. He swiftly recommended progressive measures. Congress swiftly enacted them. He swiftly signed them.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions, and through increased services for the protection of children and the prevention of ill health.
He took other measures, bolstered up our crumbling economy, got industry and labor to agree on a program, enacted the nation's first major farm law to aid the country's helpless farmers, and wheels began to turn. Smokestacks were no longer idle. People streamed back to work. The empty pantry filled up again. And there was special help for the aged and the blind and for the nation's needy children. Wage and hour legislation strengthened the working man. Roosevelt started not only the wheels of industry turning again, but the threshing machines and the harrows of the farmer. He took on the battle against nature, against man's ancient enemies, drought, flood, and erosion. He planned TVA to harness the wild power that had hitherto destroyed and killed, so that it might become man's servant and give comfort instead of terror. Out of this democratic planning came the magnificent series of dams along the Tennessee. The Chickamauga, Pickwick Landing, Guntersville, Wilson, and many others. Some of them, like the great Norris Dam, FDR opened himself by pressing a telegraph key. In addition to the protection of life and property against catastrophic floods, all of these meant low-cost power, modernization, and a new lease on life to farmers, homeowners, and industries, pouring new wealth into the bloodstreams of the nation's economy. The great atomic center at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, vital to our national defense, could not have been built without plentiful power from these hydroelectric plants. Other huge, life-giving dams were built and opened in the Southwest and Northwest. Power for the West Coast, a whole new giant aluminum industry for the booming Northwest. Of course, none of this progress was without resistance, and from the usual quarters, the Republican top brass. But the nation grew strong and prospered all the same. It got blood transfusions from the great public work projects, which produced, among hundreds of other lasting accomplishments, the Oakland Bridge, new highways, new schools, slum clearance, housing projects, the protection of national resources, not the least of which was the conservation of our youth through the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and even greater than the accomplishments in stone and steel, advances in human and civil rights, improving the welfare of minorities, total abolition of child labor, securing for labor the right to bargain collectively, appointment of the first woman member of a cabinet, Secretary of Labor, Madam Frances Perkins, the repeal of prohibition, measures against erosion, against the wanton waste of fertile land, the reckless depletion of our resources by narrow interests, the introduction of new and enlightened agricultural methods. Once again, the Democratic Party, as close to earth as a Jefferson plow, gave the country a great leader. But elsewhere in the world, a quite different kind of leader had been destroying freedoms as energetically as Franklin Roosevelt was extending them. He had allies, Mussolini and his black shirts, and the warlords of Japan. There is no need to recite the familiar and morbid events that led up to our participation in the war, but it is important to recall where the rival parties stood on the issues of defense and preparedness. For while the Republican-led isolationists were belittling the threat to our security, FDR clearly foresaw the dangers. And when bill after bill on preparedness came up in Congress, all but a few Republicans ignored the growing threat to our national security. Listen to just a small fraction of the roll call. Fortification of Guam. The majority of Republicans voted against it. Increasing airplane production. Republican majority against it. The draft. Republican majority against. Lend-Lease, Republican majority against. Draft extension, Republican majority against. Aid to Britain, Republican majority against. And so on and on. But thanks to a Democratic majority in Congress, and thanks to the clear mandate given to FDR by the people in 3 elections, all of these vital defense measures passed, so that when the Japanese attacked, we were not caught with a defenseless and vulnerable mainland. We had 2 million men under arms. Our industry was mobilized. We were ready for total global war. And just as FDR led us out of the worst depression in history, so he led us to the brink of victory in history's fiercest war. And long before the end was in sight, he planned for the peace, just as Wilson had planned ahead. He spared neither his comfort nor his health. He flew to the far corners of the earth for conferences with our fighting allies. It was exhausting business, and when he returned from his last overseas conference, he was tired. The burden of office had taken its toll. From the robust FDR of 1932 to the war-worn and travel-weary Commander-in-Chief of 1945. And on a day in the spring of 1945, in this cottage at Warm Springs, Georgia, he died. History will never forget the nation's mournful farewell to him, nor the moving words of the man who succeeded him, Harry S. Truman.
It is with a heavy heart that I stand before you, my friends and colleagues in the Congress of the United States. Tragic fate has thrust upon us grave responsibilities. We must carry on. With great humility, I call upon all Americans to help me keep our nation united in defense of those ideals which have been so eloquently proclaimed by Franklin Roosevelt.
The nation under Harry Truman completed the victory over fascism so well begun by FDR. The Nazis were brought to their knees, and also the Japanese. Later, the threat of communism in Greece and Turkey was met by clear, bold action, by establishing the Truman Doctrine, immediate help to the countries menaced by communist aggression. Then there was the Marshall Plan, strengthening the economies of nations so that they could better resist the poverty and disease upon which communism flourished. In 1948 came a new election. The all-knowing experts, the analysts, the poll takers, the prophets, confidently predicted a sweeping Republican victory. If you've forgotten what happened, let Mr. Truman tell you in his own words.
I had my sandwich and glass of buttermilk and went to bed at 6:30. And along about 12 o'clock, I happened to wake up for some reason, and the radio was turned on the National Broadcasting Company. And Mr. Kaltenborn and Mr. Harkness were reporting the situation as it then developed. And Mr. Kaltenborn was saying, well, the president is 1 million votes ahead in the popular vote. We have yet to hear. Very sure that when the country vote comes in, Mr. Truman will be defeated by an overwhelming majority. And then Mr. Harkness came on and he analyzed the situation as Mr. Kaltenborn had reported it. And to the sorrow of myself and those of who were listening with me, it looked very much as if the election would be thrown into the House of Representatives because it was not possible for me to get a majority of the electoral votes of the nation. And I went back to bed and went to sleep.
Harry Truman conceived of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a bulwark against red repetition of the divide and conquer tactics which almost succeeded for the Nazis. He won a showdown dispute over supplies to Berlin through the Berlin Airlift. And then, most important of all, he galvanized the United States and United Nations into immediate and vigorous resistance to communist military aggression in Korea. Through all this on the home front, benefiting from the economic laws of Wilson and Roosevelt, Truman's Democratic administration headed off, for the first time in history, a post-war depression. The Fair Deal carried on where the New Deal left off. In 1953, when the Republicans took over the government, after 20 years of Democratic leadership, they inherited a country healthier than it had ever been, a country that was vibrant, prosperous. Our national income was at an all-time high. So was corporate expansion. So were corporate profits. Our international prestige was high. Our foreign policy was clear and firm. If Thomas Jefferson had come back to Washington in '53, when the Democrats relinquished the White House, he would have been dazzled by many things, astonished by many changes. But he would have recognized in the Democratic Party the same principles that he had stood for almost 2 centuries ago. Principles that have kept the party young, vital, fit for action, not softened by stagnation, but progressive and forward-looking. The unforgettable FDR summed it up once.
I propose to sail ahead. For to reach a port, we must sail. Sail, not lie at anchor. Sail, not drift.
And the ports of call, the unchanging destinations of the Democratic Party, remain as always: free enterprise, prosperity not for the few but the many, freedom of thought and conscience, freedom from fear, social progress, security, peace, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the beacons of the democratic faith, the goals we seek, the objectives we will never abandon. For the proud past of the Democratic Party is but a prelude to its future, to the leadership it offers the nation, to the faith by which we all abide.